Joe Rayome, and I started working on this game over 10 years ago. I successfully kickstarted it in 2015, but it ended up taking me 4 years to release the final version, mostly because I was working full-time as a game designer and programmer during most of the development. The elevator pitch for this game is a Metroidvania starring a transforming robot or mech suit, where you explore a solar system to collect new forms and power-ups. All of the forms you collect are inspired by classic arcade games of the late 70s and early 80s. Starting here where you have a robot form that can run and jump through fireballs like Mario. And then the first form you collect is a tank that shoots upwards like in Space Invaders. The power-up collection system was inspired by Cave Story. It's a way to give the player infinite continues to keep them from getting too frustrated, but also provide an incentive to not take damage or die. I also ended up using it to provide alternate ways to solve puzzles for when you don't have a certain upgrade yet. The first power level of the robot form doesn't give you a projectile, but if you collect enough power, you get fireballs that work like in Super Mario Bros. The next level fireballs here bounce around like in Super Mario Land, and then the final giant fireballs linger on the ground like in one of the weapons in Cave Story. There are a lot of screens in Mechagami that are set up to just be a mini-game version of Space Invaders or Missile Command, and this is the first example. This is also a simple progression gate that requires you to have the tank so you can shoot the toggle switch to deactivate the force field. The power-up speech in this game was made using a text-to-speech program called Analog X Say It. It's meant to be similar to the speech synthesizer from the arcade game Berserk. All the sound effects were made using a chip sound emulator called SFXR. You can actually damage boost off these spine beetles to skip part of the level and get the jump boost through the back door, but I don't know if you save much time doing it. Damage boosting at the start of this game was meant to be a viable speedrun strategy. The earliest prototype of Mechagami goes back to just after I'd released Chronotron, when I was active on the FlashGameLicense.com developer-only web forums. We used to host game jams and take turns hosting and judging. One of the prompts was Metamorphosis. I wanted to make a game that required the player to mentally remap the control scheme whenever they changed forms, and I built a little arcade-style flash game where you could transform between the control schemes of Space Invaders, Asteroids, and Missile Command. You had to transform to respond to the threats from each game, and there were mechanics that rewarded you for using the right form. There was an economy where you could collect crystals and buy power-ups, and different levels named after planets that provided different challenges. Like a lot of my post-Chronotron games, I ended up abandoning it because it just wasn't feeling right. I kept thinking about the premise for years, and eventually after being laid off at my job at Sega, I decided to build the idea into a Metroidvania where I could explore the transformation concept and also incorporate a lot of other ideas that I'd had in the meantime. The green invader enemies on this screen start out in their angry mode that usually only happens if they get damaged without being killed in one shot. That's because when angry they have a secondary fire mode that targets the player. You can use this to skip several screens and get the artillery mode power up through the back door by getting one of them to destroy the block for you. This was another intentional speedrunning secret. The artillery mode and the later hover jets you can get for the tank are pretty clearly an homage to Blaster Master. Many of the enemies can also transform. All of the Space Invaders inspired enemies have a second form that they take when they're damaged but not killed. The angry mode versions of these enemies are more dangerous, which is meant to encourage the player to kill them in one hit using the more powerful shot from the tank. The caterpillars will turn into Luna moths and fly at the player if they spend too long on one screen. Likewise, the isopods will transform into these creatures here, that were obviously inspired by the Hydralisks from StarCraft, that were obviously inspired by the Tyranids from Warhammer 40k. These isolisks were part of a Kickstarter backer incentive to design or request an enemy. This part of the level is full of question blocks that are guaranteed to drop large power-ups. This is because there's a secret shield upgrade that you can only get by maxing out the tank's power, or by coming back after getting the charge beam from the moon. Mechagami doesn't ever require a lot of backtracking, so you can be pretty sure that if the game is giving you a lot of power-ups, there's probably a use for them coming up soon. Here you can see that I'm ignoring the new missile launcher form for now, and carefully clearing out these blocks, so I can use the force field to bounce the fully powered shot down onto these carbonite blocks. I used the level design earlier to show the player a few times that force fields reflect shots, and that if you were paying attention a few screens back, you can experiment and figure out that carbonite can only be destroyed by fully charged tank shots. This leads to one of many shield upgrade power-ups that you can find on this planet. This part is meant to force the player to learn that the missile can pass right through these force fields, and that the targeting reticule can pick up these red power-ups. This screen is meant to give you a chance to practice quick transforming to respond to different threats. You can use the tank to shoot the spine beetle, then turn into the missile launcher and take out all 4 quadrupus enemies with one explosion. I know I just said that Mechagami doesn't require much backtracking, and that's true, but it does reward exploration. Down on this screen with the pyramid, there are these blocks with missile icons on them that can obviously only be destroyed by a missile. This just leads to another optional shield upgrade. The red checkpoints that turn green when you pass them are where you respawn if you die. Many indie games of the 2010s used this design, but I was probably specifically inspired by VVV. The Black Widow spider enemies that crawl at you and occasionally reverse their own gravity are also a small nod to VVV. The environmental storytelling concept of this level is that there was some ancient Egypt-like civilization on a Mars-like planet. Whatever other story you want to give this game is up to you. The player might be a tiny human pilot who is exploring the planet and found a giant transforming mecha and decided to take it on a joyride, or maybe it's a sentient robot that was just activated. While I love games with deep stories, I tend not to make them myself. This game is more about how much fun it is to be able to transform at will, so it gives you a series of challenges that require you to do that. You could maybe argue that this was a subconscious game about gender fluidity, but what had been going through my head since I started working on this game was a joke image I remember seeing of a plaque added to some old arcade game that read something like, "Game plot. Everyone in space hates you. Press this button to kill them." That's really the basic plot of many early arcade games, and I played and researched the history of so many of those while I was developing this. I made all the sprite and background art in Paint.net. I used a tile mapping program called Dame to create all the tile maps for the level layout and the background. You can provide Dame with a tile sheet and then have it cut it into tiles, which you can then paint with a simple editing program. Then you can export these as CSVs with a bunch of numbers and commas. I used the Flixel engine to create Mechagami in Flash, and it has a built-in tile map import feature. There's actually a secret pacifist mode in this game. If you manage to get here without killing any enemies, the game music never starts playing, enemies don't fire at you, and bosses don't appear. I'm not sure how plausible it is to beat the entire game without killing an enemy, though. Here I'm trying hard not to kill this Octomom boss right away. If you have full power in tank mode, this fight is over in about 2 seconds. Octomom shrinks a little every time she takes damage, and she spawns a number of quadrupus enemies that home in on you. She also vaguely follows you, getting lower if you're low and higher if you're high. I'm trying to show off this behavior a little bit, so I'm not killing her right away. The text-to-speech this boss is saying when it spawns and after you kill it is from the Call of Cthulhu. This volcano here represents what's supposed to be the moment in Mechagami where you realize there are multiple planets you can visit, and that you can just fly into space once you get the rocket. You're meant to fall down the volcano and shoot straight out, and get carried away with your momentum and end up in space. I'm not doing that here because I'm goofing around getting more power-ups for the rocket mode, so I have the rapid fire spread shot. This is also a chance to practice jumping in robot form, hitting the transform key to turn into a rocket, and use the momentum from your jump to blast off. When I played Super Metroid as a kid, I imagined what it would be like if Samus could just get into her ship and fly to other worlds, and maybe have a space minigame be part of navigating to them. Later, when I was doing research on the history of arcade games for this project, I learned that Atari had published a game called Gravitar, which was sort of a hybrid of Asteroids and Lunar Lander, where you could fly around in space and visit planets that each had their own gravity and unique challenges. That ended up being so close to what I wanted this game to be like, I ended up calling the working title of the project Schmavatar, until I thought of the name Mechagami. You might notice the save data file is still named Schmavatar. There's actually a lot more of Osiris to explore, but I left it out of this playthrough. I also think I'm going to cut my commentary into one video per world, so this will be the end of the first part of my creator commentary series. Next time, we'll play some Gravitar and Lunar Lander on a moon level called Ereshkigal.